Let's talk about the Steiner brothers, two genetic freaks who were absolute masters of mayhem in the ring. They were controversial, they were intense, and they were damn entertaining. Now, if you don't know about the Steiner brothers, man, you missed out on some of the most intense, high-impact, and downright crazy tag team action ever seen in a wrestling ring. Rick and Scott Steiner, two real-life brothers with legit amateur wrestling backgrounds, brought a whole new level of intensity to the squared circle. These dudes were absolute powerhouses. But before they were throwing dudes around like rag dolls in WCW and WWF, Rick and Scott were tearing it up on the mats at the University of Michigan. They were all-American wrestlers. These guys were the real deal. And that amateur background gave them a foundation that few other wrestlers could match. They achieved great success in WCW, winning the WCW World Tag Team Championship multiple times. But alongside their success, their careers have been filled with controversies, conflicts, and even a dramatic fallout between the two brothers. Let's talk about their wrestling style first. Rick and Scott weren't just good, they were intense. Their moves were hard-hitting and powerful, the kind of stuff that made you wince while watching. But sometimes they took things a bit too far. Other wrestlers would accuse them of being stiff, which basically means hitting harder than necessary or being rougher than they needed to be. Some even felt like they were getting hurt on purpose. This kind of thing didn't just stay in the ring, it led to a lot of backstage tension and, in some cases, actual fights. One of the wildest stories involves Scott Steiner and Sid Vicious getting into a backstage brawl during their time in WCW. Things got so bad that both of them ended up injured. It was like their in-ring intensity followed them into real life. But the drama doesn't stop there, especially when it comes to Scott Steiner. When Scott transformed into his Big Papa Pump persona, he became larger than life, not just physically, but in every way. He was loud, brash, and completely unpredictable. His promos, or the parts where wrestlers talked to the crowd or their opponents, became infamous. Scott would just go off script and say whatever was on his mind. Sometimes it was funny, sometimes it was shocking, and sometimes it just caused a ton of problems. Scott didn't hold back, even if it meant calling out other wrestlers, management, or the company he worked for. While fans often loved how raw and unfiltered he was, it created a lot of issues backstage. People didn't always appreciate being dragged into Scott's chaos, and it led to plenty of strained relationships. But the Steiner brothers' issues weren't just about wrestling. In 1998, they found themselves in legal trouble after being involved in a road rage incident. This only added to their growing list of controversies and gave fans yet another reason to see them as larger-than-life figures, sometimes for the wrong reasons. And then came the end to it all. Despite all this, Rick and Scott were an incredible tag team. But as their careers went on, their partnership began to change. Scott's rise as a single star was a big turning point. When he became Big Papa Pump, he stepped into the spotlight in a way that left Rick in the background. WCW started pushing Scott as a main event player, and the focus on their tag team partnership started to fade. This shift didn't just happen professionally, it seemed to affect their relationship too. Rick and Scott were very different people. Rick was quieter and more reserved, while Scott's personality was loud and in your face. Over time, those differences seemed to create distance between them. And when Scott turned on Rick during a WCW storyline, it felt like an on-screen reflection of real-life tensions. After their split, the Steiner brothers didn't team up much, and there were rumors that they weren't even on speaking terms. For years, it seemed like their bond as brothers had been completely broken. It was a sad turn of events for two guys who had been so close and so successful together. But as with many wrestling stories, this one eventually found its happy ending. After years of estrangement, Rick and Scott reconciled. They even reunited as a tag team later in their careers, showing that time really can heal old wounds. Watching them back together reminded fans of what made them so special in the first place. Even after everything they'd been through, they could still entertain a crowd and work together like the old days. The Steiner brothers' story is a roller coaster. On one hand, they're two of the most talented wrestlers of their era, a tag team that changed the game with their power and creativity. On the other hand, their careers are filled with controversies, fights, and moments that tested their bond as brothers. But perhaps the most important part of their story is how it ends. Rick and Scott's reconciliation is a reminder that even the toughest relationships can be repaired. Family is family after all, and the Steiner brothers proved that theirs was strong enough to survive even the wild world of professional wrestling. Now for the real ones out there, here is a quick rundown of their early lives and careers. Rick and Scott Steiner weren't always the wrestling powerhouses we know them as today. They started off as two brothers growing up in Bay City, Michigan, where they learned early on that they were both born athletes. Sports were a big part of their lives, but wrestling, in particular, was something they excelled at. Rick, the older brother, was the first to really make a name for himself in wrestling. He attended the University of Michigan, where he was an absolute beast on the mat. He earned All-American honors in 1983, a massive achievement in amateur wrestling. Rick's style was all about power and intensity, which would later become his signature as a professional wrestler. Scott, the younger of the two, wasn't far behind. He also wrestled at the University of Michigan and quickly showed he had the same talent and drive as his big brother. The Steiner boys, that's their real last name, were naturals when it came to wrestling. It was only a matter of time before they took their skills to the next level. Rick made the leap into professional wrestling first, debuting in 1983. Right away, people could see that he had something special. He brought his amateur wrestling background into the ring, and it made him stand out. He was tough, skilled, and had an intensity that couldn't be ignored. Scott followed a few years later, debuting in 1986. When they finally teamed up, it was clear they had something magical. The Steiner brothers officially became a tag team in the late 1980s, and they hit the ground running. They weren't like other tag teams at the time. Rick and Scott were a perfect combination of raw power, technical skill, and athleticism. Scott brought a level of agility that was rare for a guy his size, pulling off moves like his iconic Frankensteiner. Fans went nuts for it. Rick, on the other hand, was all about brute strength and intensity. Together, they were unstoppable. Their big break came in WCW, World Championship Wrestling, where they became one of the top tag teams of the late 80s and early 90s. They dominated the division, winning championship after championship and delivering some of the best matches fans had ever seen. The Steiner brothers weren't just good, they were must-watch. But WCW wasn't the only place they made an impact. The Steiners also made a splash in New Japan Pro Wrestling, where they became huge stars. Japanese fans loved their mix of power and technical skill, and the Steiners thrived in the Japanese wrestling scene. They also had a memorable run in WWE, then called WWF, in the early 90s. Even though their time in WWE wasn't super long, they left a big impression on fans in the tag team division. Their split in WCW was a big moment. When Scott turned on Rick during a storyline, it marked the official end of the Steiner brothers as a tag team. Fans were shocked, but it also felt like an inevitable step given the direction their careers were heading. Unfortunately, this on-screen betrayal also reflected some real-life tensions between the two brothers. For a long time, it seemed like their relationship was strained, both professionally and personally. For years, it felt like the Steiner brothers were done, not just as a tag team, but as brothers. Rumors swirled about their falling out, and they rarely appeared together. Fans who grew up watching them dominate the ring were left wondering if they'd ever see Rick and Scott back on the same page. Thankfully, time has a way of healing old wounds. After years of separation, Rick and Scott eventually reconciled. They reunited for a few tag team appearances later in their careers, and it was like a nostalgic blast from the past for fans. Seeing them work together again was a reminder of just how special they were as a team. So, where are they now? These days, both Rick and Scott are mostly retired from wrestling. Scott still pops up every now and then for special appearances in promotions like Impact Wrestling or on the independent circuit. Even in his 60s, he's still got that larger-than-life personality that fans love. Rick has taken a quieter road in retirement. He's focused more on his family and personal life, but wrestling is still a big part of the Steiner legacy. His son, Bronson Rex Steiner, better known as Braun Breaker, is now making waves in WWE's NXT brand. Braun is carrying on the family tradition with his own mix of power and athleticism, and fans can't help but see shades of both Rick and Scott in him. The Steiner brothers have also gotten the recognition they deserve. In 2022, they were inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, a moment that brought them back into the spotlight. Watching them celebrate their incredible careers together was a heartwarming moment for fans who've followed them since the beginning. Their journey hasn't been without its challenges, but the Steiner brothers have left a legacy that's impossible to ignore. From their amateur wrestling roots to their dominance in professional wrestling, Rick and Scott have done it all. They've entertained millions, inspired countless wrestlers, and shown that family bonds can endure even the toughest of times. Thanks for sticking around to hear the full story of Rick and Scott Steiner. If you enjoyed this, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more wrestling stories and deep dives into the legends of the ring. Until next time, take care.